are really designed to eat several small meals throughout the day versus one large meal. So that's why they're grazing all day, or if they have a hay net or something like that, they're always picking, is because their stomach empties so quickly. It's really designed for them to eat several small meals versus just one large meal, and putting that down to making them just eat one meal can actually lead to like digestive issues or colic. So it's best, if possible, to always make sure that they can get access to several small meals throughout the day. Horses are hindgut fermenters. So basically what that means, they have a cecum, and it's behind their stomach. It's kind of at the end of their digestive tract that provides a place for the fermentation. So that's where a lot of the fibers are broken down from the forages and hay that they eat. And it's really, it doesn't sound super important, but it's important simply because if you think of cows or ruminants or animals like that, all those ruminants and stuff have the first chamber of their stomach or second chamber of their stomach dedicated to the fermentation of the fibers and the roughages that they're eating. In horses, it's all the way back at the end of their gut. So anything that's passing through has to go all the way through their digestive tract before it hits the cecum and is fermented. And I've always heard it that way. That's why horses don't do moldy hay very well. With cows, it's certainly not ideal, but you can kind of dilute it out. Horses, it can be really bad, and part of that is due to the fact that it has to pass all the way through the rest of their digestive tract before it can get to a place where it can be broken down and fermented. So horses also have a strong esophageal sphincter, which basically means, I think most people know that horses can't throw up or really don't throw up. And it only becomes important when something toxic enters their body. So vomiting is a way that most species empty their stomach and empty their tract of toxins. So if something bad enters a horse's system, it has to pass all the way through, which once again is 48 to 72 hours unless the body is doing something to speed up that elimination process. So it becomes a problem, like once horses eat something that's bad for them, it's a lot harder to get through, and they have to wait until it passes through. So that's another reason like colic in horses is so severe and can be so big. So, but that's just a little bit of like overall digestive anatomy, and some of it will come back as we talk a little bit. So what do horses need? Basically the same thing as any other animal. Two main things are energy and protein. So when we balance diets, that's what we're going to look at, are their digestible energy and then their protein requirements for the horse. Everything else is kind of the extra add-ons, but when we're balancing our ration, we look mostly at those two things. So energy for horses comes from two sources, so fats and carbohydrates. Fats are like the oils and stuff like that, and then carbohydrates are really the starches and the sugars. So it kind of breaks down into like what's a little more digestible for the horse, and then what can cause problems with the horse, and we'll talk about that a little later on as well. Protein will measure in crude protein. A lot of feed tags and labels and stuff will start off listing the minimum crude protein in a feed, but protein also is measured in amino acid requirements. So amino acids are basically just the building blocks of the proteins, and when a horse eats a lot of protein, what happens is that the body breaks that protein down into the individual amino acids and then sends them throughout the body to be rebuilt and reused into tissues later. So when we hit a limiting amino acid, that means that they're done. They can't use anything else, even if they have excess left over of other amino acids. So if they need so much of lysine, which is usually, in a lot of animal diets, lysine tends to be like the first limiting. So once they run out of lysine, it doesn't matter what they have of everything else. They can't make the protein they need if they're out of one or the other amino acid. So you can also balance for individual amino acids. A lot of times if one is known to be lacking, you can add those individually into the diet. But when we balance, it's also just on a crude protein basis. And then vitamins and minerals, just like any other animal or humans, they need certain vitamins and minerals. Generally speaking, those can be either provided in their main diet or supplemented pretty easily. It's not super difficult to get those in. So this is It's a little bit of a complicated looking table, but really we're only going to look at a few things. So every few years, the National Research Council gets together and they do research and a little bit of revamping on the nutrient requirements for a specific species, and they have them for just about any species. I want to say the newest NRC requirements for horses is like 2006 or 2007, something like that. But anyway, this is a little bit of information taken from that. This is one of their tables. And if you look, all of it bases it off of a 500 kilogram mature horse, about an 1,100 pound horse. And it gives the different classifications of their life. So what life stage they're at. And then it's going to go through, and it's going to say like their dry matter intake per pound, or how many pounds of dry matter intake they should have, how much dry matter intake they should have as a percent of their body weight. Really what I'm going to look at more than anything are these two numbers right here. So this is the digestible energy, and then this is the crude protein values. And it's going to tell you about how many, this is megacalories, and then how many grams of crude protein they need in their diet each day. And this has the maintenance horses, a breeding stallion, so these requirements would be during breeding season, a pregnant mare during her last trimester of gestation, and then the entire time she's lactating, and then the different levels of work if the horse is in work. And then all these down here, lysine, this is one of the amino acids. Like I said, that one's one that's normally limiting. So they'll put the lysine requirements in there, and then some of the vitamins and minerals are also in here. But we'll come back to this. I have an example of actually balancing a ration, so I'll come back and look at this a little later, but I just wanted to like introduce it and show it. So where to start? Basically, first you need to just know what you're feeding for. So know what stage of life your horse is at, and know like what kind of work they're going to be doing or what kind of work they are doing, because once you know that, you're going to be able to take into account the differing needs. So for most horses, they're either on a maintenance diet, meaning that they're not really in much work, or a performance diet, which means that they're working, they're exercising regularly. And pretty common sense that as the intensity of the workout increases, so does the horse's nutritional needs, because they're putting so much into their body. Generally across the board, but especially horses in lighter to moderate work, their energy needs are going to increase slower than protein needs. So it's pretty easy to think that because they're working that they just need a lot of energy, but actually, like, yes, their energy is increasing, but their protein needs are going to increase more because their body is using it for repair and then to build on the muscle. So it's not always a good idea just to pour a lot of high energy feed into them and not take into account that they're also having a growing protein need as well. Gestation and lactation for mares. The protein needs really start increasing at the beginning of the second trimester of pregnancy, and then you normally peak just prior to foaling. And this table actually has them peaking a little bit after foaling. They remain high all the way through lactation simply because she's also making milk for her foal. But something that's pretty interesting is that their energy needs don't really increase through their pregnancy. They're going to spike just prior to foaling, and then their energy needs are going to remain really high throughout the entire time that they're lactating, just because that their body takes so much energy to produce the milk for the foal, whereas they don't really need so much energy during gestation. They just need the protein requirements to facilitate the development of the foal. So you don't really have to worry about pouring a high energy feed or something to them right until like right before foaling. That's when their energy needs are really going to start increasing. Growth is something not even mentioned on the NRC table. It would have to be on a separate one. They're just changing so quickly. They're growing so quickly. And then feeding a foal can be challenging. Their nutritional requirements increase from the time that they're weaned all the way through the time they're mature. So like you're looking at least 3 years old. But it can be a challenge because they're needing a lot of nutrients and they're seeing a huge increase in the amount of nutrients they need, but their voluntary intake is low because they have a small stomach. So even though nutritional requirements are growing the entire time they're maturing. They're growing at a decreasing rate. So they're growing much faster when they're young versus when they get to like a 2-year-old. Then their nutritional needs are growing at a much slower rate. So it's harder to find feeds that are going to pack as much nutrients as they need, even though their voluntary intake is going to be lower than it's going to be with them as a 2-year-old. So feeding foals just takes a little bit of practice. There are foal feeds, special feeds for them, high energy things, high protein requirements. But it really kind of takes a little bit of special attention to make sure that a growing foal is fed properly. And then the maintenance horses are pretty easy. They're mostly just, honestly, a lot of them, unless they're just a hard keeper, you feed them and they do okay. They're pretty easy. They're pretty easy keepers, generally speaking. So, but once you figure out what you're feeding for, then you can really start looking at what you're going to be feeding them. And the NRC table is a pretty good place to start. It gives you at least a starting place when you're thinking of like, oh, what am I going to feed, or how are their nutritional needs going to change, especially if you're looking at maybe breeding a stallion or breeding a mare, or taking a horse that's been basically a pasture ornament for a while and starting to build them up, put them into work. I will say like this about the NRC tables. The book that they're in is actually pretty expensive. I think it's almost $100, but this, you should be able to at least Google some of the requirements. So if you can't find the whole thing, then it's at least possible to Google, and you should be able to find a table like that. So when you're creating a ration, you always want to start with your basal feeds or your forages, and that's just pasture, hay, whatever you do as far as your living situation for your horse, whether they're stalled or out in pasture most of the time. And pasture just basically allows unlimited access to the nutrients. So that can be a good thing, but not always. So I'm thinking horses that are like really easy keepers and tend to pack on a lot of weight, horses with certain metabolic conditions, things like that. They can be problematic, especially early spring, when the sugar content in the grass is a lot higher. So like the fresher grasses tend to be a lot higher in sugar. And so that's why like some horses, it's just best to limit their access. Some horses don't do well out in a stall, like stalling them for certain periods of time just isn't very feasible unless it's just super necessary. Excuse me. Some horses do better on like a dry lot or a small paddock, or a grazing muzzle. So all of those are options to kind of limit their access to forage if they tend to overeat or if they tend to gorge themselves. So the other forage that we look at a lot is hay, and just the quality and the nutritional value of the hay really varies immensely. So different between hays. So grass hay obviously provides a lot lower protein levels than legumes like alfalfa. So if you're comparing like fescue to alfalfa, it's like the fiber content, the protein content, all across the board pretty different. And then even if you have 2 bales of the same type of hay, depending on where they come from and depending on the conditions of the field in which they were harvested, it can be pretty different. So hay that is all stems has a lower nutritional value because the stems are mostly a lot of fiber. And there's a lot of indigestible nutrients caught up in that the horses aren't able to obtain. So when you're looking for hay, you want something that smells fresh, you want a decent color to it. You want to be able to see some leaves in it. You don't want something that's super stemmy. And excuse me, there we go. You just want to look for something that looks like it's going to be palatable and good for your horse. You don't want something that's musty or full of dust. You don't want to be able to pull it apart and see that there's a lot of dust or mold in it. All of that really decreases the nutritional quality of the hay and can actually affect your horse's health. So after the forages, the next thing to look at is the grain. So it's usually added as an extra protein or energy source if the forages that they're getting aren't meeting those requirements themselves. And they're kind of added to help like make up that difference. So whatever the hay is lacking or the pasture is lacking, that's where the grain kind of comes in to help make up that difference. There are a lot of feeds, especially if you're looking at complete feeds, that will say that you can feed them in place of hay. As saying that, like, if you feed the complete feed, that you don't even have to feed hay. And my thing would be, I would caution totally getting rid of the hay, simply because going back to the horse's stomach empties very quickly if you're feeding them one large meal of grain a day and then not providing them access to the hay. That's not the way that their stomach is designed to work. So even if you're feeding them a considerable amount of the complete feed, or something that says like feed this if you're not feeding hay, they still need access to either some pasture or some hay, something that they can kind of pick on through the day to help facilitate and help keep their stomach working normally, with being able to fill it and then let it empty and then fill it again. So, and then if you are feeding more complete feed than hay, you want to break it up into at least 2 meals a day, morning and night. You don't want to feed that all at one point during the day. So supplements kind of come in really only if they have to. That supplement market is really huge. It appeals to a lot of people simply because there are so many out there. Probably the biggest one, and I'm kind of piling in minerals with the supplements, is I know probably a good 2/3 of the people I know put mineral blocks out in their fields, which is fine. I would just caution to read the label on the mineral block, because a lot of them actually just end up being all or mostly salt. So they're not, and while salt is necessary, if you're feeding a mineral block that is more salt than anything else or just doesn't have a lot of minerals in it, then you're not doing the horses as much good as you can. They make bagged minerals. They do make some good mineral blocks. It's just reading the labels and seeing. You also have to consider that with mineral blocks, you're going to have quite a bit of loss. So if it rains, you're going to have some loss. The horses have unlimited access to it, so you have no control really over how much that they're going to be eating. So they, if you do a mineral block, just make sure to monitor it and use it wisely. And then they also make bagged minerals that you just put like a small scoop on their grain or whatever. They have joint health. They have coat health supplements. They also, I know a lot of people feed flax seeds. That helps with their coat. Hoof health. People will buy like a specially branded like hoof health supplement or biotin or something like that. They have respiratory health. They have eye health. This one right here is pretty interesting. I hadn't heard of it until recently, but it's called Eat Less. And I think it probably, and this is just personal opinion, stems from, I think a lot of people, especially now, are becoming more hesitant to use bute because concerned with like stomach ulcers and things like that. And so this is a supplement basically designed as a daily use to minimize the times that you're going to have to give your horse bute or some other kind of anti-inflammatory. And this is supposed to be like a more natural, it's a daily supplement. The interesting thing is, and I don't know if any of y'all have seen it or used it or anything like that, but a 5-pound tub is between $40 and $50. So it lasts a little over 2 months. So it's like not unbelievably expensive, but it's still $50 for 5 pounds. So that's about $10 a pound. And so when you break it down, it's one of those things that like might look really good, but also if you're not giving your horse bute on a regular basis, that it really might not be cost effective. So that's kind of the thing with all of these supplements, is that if it's not something that you really think your horse is lacking or that your horse is needing, then it gets to a place where it isn't really even cost effective. So it's basically just looking and seeing what your horse needs. If they're getting everything provided to them through their diet, then they really don't have a whole lot of need for supplements. They even have one that is specifically it is an inflammation supplement, or to provide or to promote a healthy inflammatory response. So like you name it, there's probably a supplement for it. But I would be a little slow to just say start feeding a horse a supplement if you don't notice a problem or don't think that they're going to need it, because they can get pretty expensive. So this, I apologize, is quite a bit of math, And it's all simple math. I don't want it to like look confusing because it definitely does seem that way at first, or at least to me, who is really far from being good at math. But once you do it, it actually kind of becomes second nature. It makes sense. So this is actually a screenshot of a hay sample that me and Phil took a few weeks ago. And this is from a producer in Wise County. This is square bales that are used like for horse feed. So basically all I'm going to be looking at, you can do this with any nutrient. You can get complicated and do it for 2 or 3 nutrients, however you want to balance it. I'm going to stay pretty simple and keep it to this like crude protein. So all I'm going to balance for is crude protein. So going back to the NRC table, and I should have put it back in. I'm just going to do it for an 1,100 pound horse maintenance because that's about what my horse is. And you can see this is in grams. So this is 656 grams of crude protein that this horse is needing per day. Now, one thing I did forget to mention about the NRC tables earlier is that everything on an NRC table is given to you in dry matter. So, and then if we look back at the information from the hay sample and the nutrition analysis, it is also given to us in percent of the dry matter. So any animal's ration is always, they always take the moisture out of it because it's considered a leveling factor. So if you're trying to compare the nutritional value of a dried forage like hay versus pasture grass, it really doesn't work to compare the 2 of them because the grass has such a higher moisture content. So one is going to look like it really outweighs the other in nutritional benefits when that might not be the case. The water content of a feed really skews the data. So when we do feed analysis or feed rationing, it's always on a dry matter basis. So that's where the calculation comes in. So I apologize if I go too fast. Please stop me. If I'm really confusing, please stop me. But basically, so I don't know if y'all have heard it, but the recommended amount of like hay or feed forage that the horse is getting each day is about 1 to 1.5% of their body weight. So I'm going off 1.5. So 1.5% of an 1,100 pound horse is about 16.5 pounds of hay as fed. So that's just pulling it off the bale. Went ahead, I converted it to how many pounds of hay that is as a dry matter. So you can look and it'll tell you the moisture content and the dry matter content. So the hay is 86.5% dry matter. So I just took it, I always convert my percentages to decimals. So you just move your decimal place over to. And I went ahead and multiplied that 16.5 pounds by the 86.5% of dry matter that the horse is actually getting because the water doesn't really do them much good. So the horse is getting about 14 pounds of dry matter from that hay. And then I went, so you have 14 pounds of dry matter hay, and 8.8% of that dry matter is going to be crude protein. So once again, I just converted that to a decimal and multiplied that 14 by that 8.8%. And out of that 16.5 pounds of hay that you're feeding, he's getting about 1.2 pounds of protein out of it. So the NRC requirements, once again, are in grams, not pounds, just because a lot of the nutrients are in way, way lower quantities, so pounds doesn't really make sense. So the conversion factor, the rough conversion factor is about 454 grams to a pound. So I just went ahead and multiplied the 1.2 pounds of protein by the 454 grams that are in a pound. So feeding this horse 16.5 pounds of hay a day is going to give them 545 grams of protein. So looking at the NRC table, that's where you're lacking. You still need 111 grams of protein if you were to feed this hay to an 1,100 pound horse at 1.5% of his body weight. You're either going to have to increase his hay or add something else to make up the difference, because the 111 grams can actually be fairly significant, especially if you decide to switch him over from a maintenance to a working diet. So this is where adding the grain comes in. So this is the next step. So once you have your basal feed or your forages, this is when you move into your grain. This is the basic pelleted feed, Triumph pellet feed from Southern States. It's less than $15 a bag. It's like the really basic pellet feed. And it even says for horses like maintenance to light work. And this is the guaranteed analysis. So all of the feeds will have a label on them that gives you a guaranteed analysis. And once again, it gets a little confusing because on the label, on feed tag labels, it's given to you as fed, not as a dry matter base. Still need 111 grams of protein. The pellet feed is 12% crude protein on an as-fed basis. So I don't have the exact moisture content for this food, but 10% is a pretty good rule. Most pelleted feeds or most feeds in general are going to be about 90% dry matter. So I'm just assuming 10% if you get an actual bag. I didn't have a bag with a feed tag handy. But if you get an actual feed tag, it will tell you the guaranteed analysis, the moisture content as well. But for this, I'm just assuming a 10% moisture because that's fairly common. So you have a 90% dry matter. So when you're going from an as-fed percentage to a dry matter percentage, you take the percent of the nutrient. So in this case, it's the 12% crude protein, and divide it by the dry matter percentage. So it's 12 divided by 90, and it equals about 13% crude protein on a dry matter. So not a huge difference once again because there is so little moisture in it. But once you have that this feed is 13% crude protein on a dry matter, then you can figure out exactly how much you need to give them. So we know we still need 111 grams of crude protein in this horse's diet. So you just take that and you divide it by the percentage of dry matter or percentage of the crude protein on a dry matter basis that's in the diet. So overall, you're going to give that horse 854 grams of food on a dry matter basis. So the 854 grams, and then once again, I just divided it by the 454 grams that are in a pound because for me, pound's a little easier to wrap my head around. And they're getting about 1.9 pounds of grain on a dry matter basis. So this is where, once again, you can switch it back. And this is where it gets a little confusing when you're, or a little annoying when you're going back and forth between feeds that have been given to you on an as-fed basis versus feeds that have been given to you on a dry matter, is because you're constantly kind of converting back and forth to get the measurement that you need to actually feed. But once you have like the 1.9 pounds of grain on a dry matter basis, then you can divide that again by the percentage of dry matter that's in it. So the 1.9 pounds of grain on a dry matter divided by, this is 90% of dry matter, gives you 2.1 pounds of grain as fed. So about, this horse is going to get right at 2 pounds of grain a day. So, and that's based on just the average NRC requirements. Different horses are different, but a good starting place for like an 1,100 pound horse, 16.5 pounds of hay if your hay follows like this nutrient profile, which not all of them do. That's why it's a good idea to know what's in your hay. And then just the basic pelleted feed, he'd get about 2 pounds of grain a day. This isn't super, like this long calculation wouldn't be super necessary in this situation because it's only one horse. You're only feeding 2 pounds a day. So I think I did the calculation without converting it to dry matter first, and I got something like 2.4 pounds. So you wouldn't be overfeeding him by that much. That's pretty easy. You're going to have to do some adjusting and tweaking anyway to suit what your horse needs. So in this situation, it's not super necessary to do all that converting to dry matter in as fed. It becomes a little bit more necessary if you're feeding a herd of horses. If you're trying to create a ration that's this much protein for your herd, then it becomes a little bit more necessary to sit down and actually do these calculations if you have several horses, because the more grain that you're mixing, the more your numbers are going to be off. So if you have one horse, maybe even 2 horses, is not a huge deal, but if you're feeding several horses, your numbers are going to be a lot more accurate if you take the 5 or 6 extra steps to convert back to dry matter. So, and all feed will have a feed tag label on it that has their minimum requirements. And then a hay test is pretty easy if you do your own hay, or if you're getting from someone, you can always ask them if they have a nutrient analysis done of their hay. And that just gives you a good idea of what's in it. If you know what kind of hay it is, it's also pretty easy to look it up and see kind of the average ranges of like protein and fiber that's in the average like alfalfa or like grass hay timothy, things like that. So metabolic diseases, these are pretty common. I think most people kind of know what they are. But laminitis is just the separation of the tissues within the hoof. It's sensitive and insensitive lamina in the hoof, which fold together. So there's an increase in blood flow that actually causes them to swell and inflame and then separate. So the most basic sign is lameness. The horse is going to go lame. They're going to have an elevated hoof temperature and then also an elevated digital pulse. Once that becomes kind of more severe and more chronic, then you're actually going to start seeing a rotation and then a sinking of the coffin bone. So we always say like fat horses are more prone to founder. And it is pretty true because it's linked really to like high starch contents or high sugar contents in the diet. So going back to looking at limiting their access to pasture, if you have a horse that has a history of founder, or if you have a horse that's getting obese, that puts them more at risk for founder, then that's when you really need to start looking at limiting their access to pasture. And then if you have a horse with a history of founder, the best thing to do is look for a food that's like low in starch. So they have low starch feeds. And interestingly, a lot of the senior feeds are low starch because it's considered harder to digest as the horses get older. And feeding for equine metabolic syndrome is very, very similar. So equine metabolic syndrome is about as close as horses get to having diabetes. I think there might be a few horses who have like had actual diabetes, but it's not really something that happens. They more often than not have just a failure to properly regulate their insulin levels. So once that happens, they're going to start depositing fat, especially along their back. So they're not going to deposit it as much like over their ribs, but it's going to be like they're going to get the really crusty necks. They're going to deposit a lot of fat over their tail head and over their back and loin. And once you start seeing that, it can also cause founder. So it can become a contributing factor to founder, just because kind of like founder or laminitis, is kind of worsened by the high levels of digestible energy, but also like carbohydrates. So they're kind of, carbohydrates is kind of one of those factors of digestible energy. So it's kind of one of the same things. A lot of these horses, once it gets pretty severe, are taken off pasture altogether. Really low starch feeds, and so it can actually be pretty limiting to try to feed these horses that have metabolic diseases and making sure that they're getting their full nutrients, but also making sure that they're trying to keep their lamenesses under control and keeping them comfortable. It can be a challenge, and it can unfortunately get pretty expensive. But the best thing, and mostly the first thing you're always going to see, is they're going to be taken off a lot of supplements if they're on supplements. Though several supplements can make it worse, so they'll take them off several supplements and then also put them onto a much lower starch feed. So this is kind of one of the last things. Basically, body condition scoring, if you've never done it, is pretty subjective. Most people will get in the pretty close similar range, but whereas I might see a 4, you might see a 5. It kind of depends on your eye and what you want to, honestly, what you want to see. But this is kind of one of the easiest ways of telling, and we do it all the time unconsciously, of is my horse getting what he needs? So it doesn't matter, honestly, all day long if you're following the NRC requirements to the letter. You have the highest quality feed, you have the highest quality hay. At the end of the day, if you look out and your horse is still very thin, then something's not right. And that's when you're going to, 1, start looking at other reasons as to why they're so skinny, and 2, you're going to adapt that horse's diet. So as much as we put into and research that we put into this like perfect formulation for the average horse, our horses just don't tend to be average. So the best way to gauge whether a horse's diet is sufficient is to look at them. So your ideal is a 5. Um, depending on whether you like a fleshy horse or a thinner horse, and that can also depend on breed. You might even you can even go your ideal can include a 6 or maybe even a 4. I definitely personally tend toward that 6 mark. I don't think I've ever really had a horse go to a 4. So it's just important to keep an eye on. And this is a lot of text, and I'm not going to go into all of that. But basically, it goes from 1, which is emaciated, all the way up to 9, which is extremely fat. And 1 is just as bad as the other. 1 is just as unhealthy as the other. Honestly, I think even once you start getting to a 7, and especially to an 8, you're going to start increasing your risk for laminitis and just a lot of digestive issues. So, but when you're looking at a horse, it's not just around their ribs or over their ribs. Different breeds of horse deposit fat differently. So looking over the ribs doesn't always give you a whole picture depending on the breed. So know your breed of horse and what's normal for them. And the same thing goes along with the crest of the neck. So looking at the crest of their neck isn't always the best determination of whether that horse is super fat or super skinny, depending on the breed. Some horses have, some breeds of horses hold their necks in a way that make them look a little more cresty, or some breeds of horse have a little bit more of a cresty neck. But that's definitely one place to look, is across their crest, over the top of their withers, down their back, through their loin, at the tailhead. So horses deposit fat at their tailhead, and there are some horses that you can really move that around. And those are the horses that are getting way up to an 8. And then you can also look over the ribs and then behind the point of their shoulder as well. And it's just, I would keep an eye, because it's kind of hard on a day-to-day to notice if your horse is going up or down in their weight until you come out one day and you're like, oh my goodness, my horse has gotten so fat, or oh my goodness, my horse has gotten so skinny. And it happens, especially for horses that are in work, or stallions during breeding season, mares during gestation, lactation. Those are all forms of work for a horse, so their weight tends to fluctuate. I think trying to get a mare to foal out at a 5 is hard, especially depending on the mare. It can be very hard. So you might just have to accept, if you're breeding, your mare might foal out at 4, and you're just going to have to feed her sufficiently, and it may be after she weans before you get her back up to a 6 if her BCS is normally at a 6. But just this is a good thing to do just every once in a while, to go out and actually try to look a little bit more objectively at it if you can, and be where's the fat deposits and how significant are they? So, but that's a little bit, I guess, less scientific, but a little bit more practical. If your horse is skinny, they need more food. If your horse is fat, they need to go on a grazing muzzle or need a reduction in grain. So the body condition scoring is a little bit more of a way to, if you do it regularly, to keep that in check. So that is all I have. If y'all have any questions, I am more than happy to answer them, at least to the best of my ability.
Emily, I have a question about online resources. I know there are some free software, some free software out there for sheep and cattle, where you can enter your hay scores, you can enter different feeds, and it will calculate a ration for you. And some of those are not super user friendly, some more so than others. Is there anything like that for the equine folks that you're aware of that would be pretty user friendly?
I am not aware, and I have seen some of the ones for cattle. And I'll be honest, by the time I try to figure, which I'm not very good with technology, someone who's better with the technological aspect might do it better, but by the time I tried to figure out which numbers it wanted where, I think I did better to do the little bit of multiplication and division to figure it out.
Yeah.
I'm not aware. There's probably some out there,
Right.
but I haven't come into contact with them.
Okay. Any other questions, you can type those into the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and speak up. Okay. Seeing none, well, thank you very much for another great presentation. And this is recorded, and we will be posting it on a YouTube channel for our office. If you want to go back and review that, you'll be more than welcome to. But if you have questions between now and the next session, which is next Monday night, and that's going to be on herd health, is that right, Emily?
Yes.
Just email Emily or myself, and I will make sure that those get answered.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks again. You all have a great night.